In spite of what some people may believe, Alaska was not taken or invaded by the Americans when it was officially passed from Russia to the United States on October 18, 1867. In actuality, the sale was conducted amicably, and both parties were justified in doing so. Given that Alaska is the largest state in the Union and has a current GDP of $50 billion, Russia sold Alaska for a total of $7.2 million. Given that there is no logical explanation as to why Russia would sell such a sizable area for such a small sum of money. Thus, the question is, why, exactly, did Russia sell Alaska? Why wasn't the purchase approved by everyone in the U.S.? And why has Alaska been experiencing a recession in recent years? The reasons behind Russia's sale of Alaska included both political and commercial considerations. First, it turns out that the walrus, ivory, and sea otter fur that could be acquired through trade with the local indigenous peoples of the area attracted early Russian traders to Alaska. The Russian-American enterprise established by Russian businesspeople conducted this commerce. All Alaskan mines were under the company's jurisdiction, and it had its own flag and the authority to negotiate trade agreements with other nations. The Russian government, which not only collected taxes but also owned a sizable portion of the company, the czars and their kin were among the shareholders, granted the business all these privileges. However, the sea otter population was nearly extinct by the 1990s, and as a result, the Russian corporation faced financial troubles. It was on the verge of going bankrupt, couldn't survive without significant subsidies, and losing control to the government would deplete all of its resources. Additionally, Russia was considering selling Alaska since its finances were severely harmed as a result of high military expenses after the Crimean War, in which it fought the UK, France, and Turkey. Therefore, selling Alaska seemed like a more logical course of action. Second, Russia was ill-equipped to defend Alaska because it was too big and far away. Russian commanders acknowledged that they would be powerless to stop an assault from the United Kingdom, their longtime foe. Keep in mind that the eastern part of Russia is hostile and unpopulated, and that it takes several weeks to travel by boat from St. Petersburg, the Russian capital at the time, to Alaska. As a result, it was unable to defend its territory when outside fishermen came to hunt in its waters because its navy lacked the power to patrol every inch of the remote Alaskan colony's waters. Thirdly, at the time, Russia and the United States were allies. Both countries had a certain rivalry with the UK. The United Kingdom's influence on the Pacific coast would be diminished for Russia if Alaska was sold to the United States. In other words, if the United States took control of Alaska, British Oregon would no longer attack Russia. This was yet another justification for selling Alaska, so Eduard de Stoeckel, the Russian ambassador in Washington, began discussions with Secretary of State William Seward. The two came to an agreement on the treaty transferring Alaska, which would be approved by the U.S. Senate several months later. The leaders of Russia anticipated that eventually the United States would seek to annex Alaska and rule North America. Russia believed that the United States would keep growing because it was part of the country's manifest destiny, just as they had done with Texas, New Mexico, and other regions of the South. Therefore, it was preferable to receive some compensation for selling Alaska while maintaining good relations rather than deciding Alaska's destiny in a less amicable manner. This is not to say that only the United States had territorial expansionist goals. Russia also desired to expand, having already taken control of Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and a sizable portion of Poland in 1809, and wanting to take over Crimea, Bulgaria, Romania, and Moldavia in 1815. However, as was previously mentioned, Alaska was very difficult to defend. Why wasn't everyone in the United States in favor of the acquisition of this area is the next question. Some criticized the acquisition as Seward's icebox or Seward's folly, referring to Secretary of State William Seward, who was most interested in it. Reactions to the purchase were mostly supportive, however, since many saw Alaska's possession as a basis for growing American trade with Asia. Critics argued that the United States had acquired pointless territory and that the Secretary of State wanted to become more popular within his party and enhance the reputation of President Andrew Johnson, who was then under investigation for impeachment. After purchasing this region, the United States paid little attention to Alaska for 20 years. After the purchase, almost all of the Russian immigrants left, leaving only a sparse population. Alaska didn't start to become significant until considerable gold reserves were discovered in 1896. Americans first became aware of this previously untapped land's economic potential during the gold rush. Because of its proximity to Japan during World War II and to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, its strategic importance increased even further. But it also became important due to the discovery of other natural resources, including oil, silver, lead, and copper, not just because of the gold and its location. Although it must be acknowledged that in recent decades, a significant portion of Alaska's income came from oil production, which peaked in the 1990s and has since been steadily declining as shown in the graph. Although there are still significant prospective reserves, attempts to drill for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge have run into persistent environmental opposition. Alaska experienced its lowest oil production in 40 years in 2020, in part due to the pandemic that drove oil prices to reach all-time lows. In this situation, Alaska suffered more than any other producer due to its high oil extraction expenses. A large portion of it is extracted in the state's northern region, transported by a pipeline 1,300 kilometers long, and then delivered to the other West Coast states. Due to the fact that oil prices in Alaska must reach $60 per barrel in order to be profitable, this makes the industry particularly susceptible to price changes. Since the fall in oil prices in 2014, Alaska has experienced a near-constant recession. Similarly, Alaska's unemployment rate has been higher than the national average since 2014. Additionally, the state of Alaska has a persistent deficit of over $1 billion a year due to the fact that oil no longer covers the majority of the state government's expenses because oil income generally make up a sizable amount of the public budget. Alaska has a significant edge over other states in that a statute requiring at least 25% of oil production earnings to go into a permanent investment fund was established in 1976. In its first 2 years, the fund grew gradually, reaching $137 million in 1979. After 40 years, the investment fund has grown to more than $70 billion, far exceeding Alaska's $1 billion budget shortfall. As a result, Alaska's expenses are covered by the investment fund's gains. There is no doubt that Alaska will experience a shift from an oil-based economy to one that is more diversified in the years to come. The good news is that it invested the oil boom surpluses in the permanent fund, which helps the state's finances. The bad news is that, despite having a favorable tax environment for business and business-friendly laws, it will continue to struggle with its territorial isolation and high transportation and utility costs. However, it is difficult to imagine that the United States has ever regretted spending the meager sum of $7.2 million to acquire Alaska. Please join us for the next video. Thanks for viewing.